Okay, good. So very good morning to all. My name is Mia Mikic. I am serving as the advisor to ARTNeT, and I'm thrilled to have yet another very topical webinar to moderate. So before we go on with the topic, let me just provide some housekeeping announcements. As per usual, we will be recording this webinar and then put it to the dedicated event ARTNeT page for the viewing of people who could not be with us at this particular time. And we'll be making further announcements about further sharing of this material as well as we go through the webinar. Now, in addition to this being the topic being presented by speakers whom I will introduce shortly, we will have opportunity to engage participants in the webinar with allowing them to ask questions and provide comments as is due after we hear from the speakers. So the questions you can put in the chat, or you can wait until we finish with the presentations to raise the hand and ask the question in person. Now the topic is deepening linkages between South Asia and Southeast Asia, and it is based on the same titled synthesis report that collates a very large number of papers and will be disseminated widely in June by the actually instigator of the research, the World Bank Group. The research produces, uses some novel research techniques and methods and approaches, and therefore produces some new results that provides insights in this long-standing actually issue with very sort of underutilized collaboration and cooperation in economic sense, in sense of trade and investment and mobility of resources like labor. And you can then also broaden it to ideas and knowledge, of course. So we always have found many excuses for this underutilization of the potential of collaboration, and typically they belong to sort of man-made issues or barriers and obstacles, and those that belong to the other part of the sort of natural barriers, which have to be, it has to be said that those are getting weaker and weaker in terms of importance. So the policy ones related to regulatory frameworks and to the actual removal of impediments are more and more important. All of this will be discussed, of course, in the context of great global policy uncertainty, and also the sort of looming issues that we have with the war and with the crisis in terms of not only general inflation, but more particular food insecurity and energy prices. So we have great set of speakers today who will be focusing on this research in the report. We will have Nora De Hel, who is the senior economist of the World Bank, who led the preparation of the report, who will present the research. And then we have two very well-known economists, one hailing from Europe, Hildegard Nordas, who is the associate of the Center of Economic Policies, Council of Economic Policies, but also a research professor and visiting professor at various universities. And we know her, of course, from her previous work in OECD. And Professor Mustafiz Rahman, who used to be the director of Center for Policy Dialogue, the long-standing member of ARTNeT, and a supporter of ARTNeT, also known through his many very central roles in influencing the policies in South Asia. So we are really privileged to have the troika of such capacity and knowledge with us. So without further ado, let me ask Nora to present the findings, and then we'll hear from our other two speakers, Hildegan and Mustafiz, in that order. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mia. And as you mentioned in the introductory remarks, this is a work that we have conducted over the past 2 years. And what I will try to do today is to present the key findings emerging from over 20 research papers on the topic of regional integration. So what we try to do is to see whether in the current context, there are some new integration options for countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia to promote growth of trade in goods and services, investment and labor flows. So how I will proceed with the presentation, let me see if I can move the slides. Yes. I will try to discuss a little bit the current state of integration between the two regions. And then I will move to the expected impact of deepening linkages between South Asia and Southeast Asia. What is new here is that we went beyond just trade in goods. We really tried to also look at trade in services, at investment flows, and try to quantify all these effects. And finally, we will present some policy options to consider for the countries in the two regions. I will perhaps emphasize a little bit some new areas which I believe are of interest to policymakers, so digital services, because they pose some interesting questions in terms of the regulatory approaches, and perhaps the regional context can provide some answers. And the second area is about the sustainability of trade. And we looked a little bit at environmental goods and services. So these are some new areas, and I would like to emphasize the results emerging from this research. So let me start with the current state of intra and interregional integration. So what we can see is that despite significant growth over the past 20 years, both trade and investment linkages are still limited. Trade linkages have grown by more than 9-fold over the past 2 decades. So that's significant, but there is still significant untapped potential for trade integration. So if we look at the shares, South Asian exports to Southeast Asia represent about 4.2% of South Asia's total exports. It's a little bit more when we look at Southeast Asia. The exports to South Asia represent about 25%. And usually this untapped potential in trade is coming from India's under trading with both South Asian and Southeast Asian countries. Now, FDI linkages are even more underdeveloped. Inter-regional FDI stocks amount to a total of 15 billion in 2019, up from 4.6 billion in 2009. So again, there is progress, but the untapped potential remains significant. So we found that based on the different gravity models. If we look a little bit more in depth at the untapped potential of intra and intra-regional FDI in South Asia, we will see that there is significant missing FDI. So intra-regional FDI in South Asia is estimated to be 1/5 of its potential, with an annual gap of about 14 billion in 2019. The gap between South Asia and Southeast Asian FDI stocks stands at half of their potential. So again, we have a significant gap here. If we try to explain what is driving, these trends, we need to look at the different policy instruments that are in place. And starting with tariffs, we can see that the South Asian tariffs applied on imports from Southeast Asia are nearly 3 times higher than Southeast Asian tariffs on imports from South Asia. So in Southeast Asia, 6.9% is the average in South Asia as compared to 2.8% in Southeast Asia. So it seems that when it comes to tariffs, South Asian countries are more restrictive than Southeast Asian ones. Moving on to non-tariff barriers, looking at the ad valorem equivalent of non-tariff barriers, we see that they remain more important than tariffs in both regions. So it's quite striking to see these numbers. The average inter-regional ad valorem tariff equivalents in South Asia are 225%. If we compare them with tariffs, where we were below 10%, we see how significant it is. And so just to clarify, when we talk about these non-tariff measures, yes, we are covering a broad range of measures, such as sanitary and phytosanitary requirements, technical barriers to trade, pre-shipment inspections, non-automatic licensing requirements, price control measures. So there is a lot that goes into this category of non-tariff measures. And we know that some of these non-tariff measures are justified and they aim to protect human health or safety or plant or animal life. But there are many that serve protectionistic purposes and are a significant deterrent to trade and an impediment to the competitiveness of firms. So non-tariff barriers remain extremely significant. Moving on to trade facilitation, it definitely needs to improve in both regions. So there is significant room to improve the efficiency of trade processes and that of control agencies, customs, and border authorities in the region. While the time and cost of trading goods in both regions remain high, some countries have made progress with the implementation of the WTO trade facilitation agreement commitments, which definitely helps with trade facilitation issues. And we also see that reflected in some of the trade facilitation indicators. What we have here is the OECD Trade Facilitation Index, which seems to capture some of that progress. So moving on to services, one of the new areas covered in the report, we also see that the ad valorem equivalents of services trade policies are high relative to tariff rates for goods. So they are in excess of at least 10% in all cases, but they are as high as 70% in some sectors, so higher than tariffs. We show here the results for 4 sectors: telecom, financial services, transport, and distribution. And these numbers are based on research done by Ben Shepard using machine learning techniques and inputs from the OECD and World Bank services trade indicators. So to try to come up with such indices even for countries where such information was missing. So again, the key finding, the key takeaway is that services barriers seem to be more important than the tariffs and sometimes also the non-tariff measures affecting trade in goods. So what we try to do then is to assess what would be the impact of removing or reducing some of these barriers. And I will present results from two empirical exercises. One is an economy-wide assessment of the impact of policy reforms. And those familiar with the computable general equilibrium models probably know the GTAP model. So what we are doing here, we are extending the GTAP model to include FDI, which we are considering then as a proxy for trade in services through mode 3. So we have an explicit treatment of FDI, and this enables us to represent multinationals and foreign affiliates in the model. And for that purpose, we had to also complement the GTAP database with information on FDI stocks by country and by sector, and similarly foreign affiliates sales data. So this model is ideal to include linkages between trade and investment policy. So to have this broader trade in services captured, and to include services trade policies affecting mode 1 and mode 3. So we modeled a number of scenarios, but I will present the results from 5 different scenarios. The first one is assumes a tariff liberalization between the 2 regions, and it's a uniform 90% cut on bilateral tariffs between South Asia and Southeast Asia. The second scenario adds to tariff liberalization a 50% reduction of non-tariff trade-related costs. In the third scenario, we are also modeling improvements in trade facilitation, and we do that by implying a 15% reduction in trade costs between the 2 regions. The fourth scenario also includes FDI liberalization, and what we do here is we are closing the gap in bilateral FDI by half. So the FDI gap between the 2 regions by half. And in the fifth scenario, which is the more ambitious that we are presenting today, we labeled it the open regionalism. We assume that the liberalization from scenario 4 is extended to the rest of the world. So it's not only between South Asia and Southeast Asia, but also with the other countries. So it's closer to some multilateral liberalization. And I believe the results are not surprising. Obviously, the highest impacts on GDP, exports, and imports come from the more ambitious scenarios. So the gains are increasing, with the level of ambition, especially when FDI, trade facilitation and FDI liberalization is considered. And obviously in the open regionalism scenario, we have the highest welfare gains for both regions. The gains are much higher in South Asia than in Southeast Asia, and we will discuss a little bit the underlying factors that explain that. So here we have the aggregated results, but in the report we have detailed results for all countries, and we see that most countries are gaining from these liberalization scenarios. There are some small exceptions related to trade diversion, for instance, in Nepal, But in general, all countries register significant gains, which increase, with the level of ambition. The second exercise is focused exclusively on services. And we used here a gravity model, a structural gravity model, to simulate preferential and multilateral liberalization of services in South Asia and Southeast Asia. So the details of the model are, of course, described in the paper. Again, it's our friend Ben Shepherd who is the main author of this analysis. And what we try to do here in the multilateral liberalization scenario is to reduce the services policy index score by 10%. So on a MFN basis, so with all countries, yes. And in a preferential liberalization, South Asian and Southeast Asian countries are assumed to also sign a complete network of preferential agreements among themselves. But they will keep the multilateral services trade policy index constant, yes? And what we find here, I extracted the results for two sectors, telecom and financial services. It's quite interesting that in South Asia, very often the results from preferential liberalization is much higher than from multilateral liberalization. And this we are explaining by the fact that South Asia starts with a very low level of liberalization. So in Southeast Asia, we already have a number of agreements in place when it comes to trade in services, which is not the case in South Asia. And then this will then generate these huge welfare gains when countries are opening up to their immediate neighbors. So what are the implications for policymakers here? In general, the largest gains come from non-discriminatory liberalization. So this is very much in line with the findings from the literature. But as I said, the partial exception to this finding is South Asia. And in South Asia, particularly Bangladesh is very much affected. So Bangladesh has huge gains from regional integration. And this is something that also factors into our discussions with the government, because regional integration can become then a very high priority for the country, especially in the current unstable global context. And as I tried to explain, we think that the very low initial level of liberalization is one of the explanatory factors, but I would be very interested to hear other opinions to discuss this, because I believe it's an interesting findings. And then it is very clear from these results that an ambitious regional integration agenda has much more to offer. So when we also consider trade facilitation, when we first go beyond tariffs to include non-tariff barriers, we include trade facilitation and services liberalization. So we get huge numbers. So the gains are boosted in both regions. So I think this is an important message for policymakers, even if we have to take these results with care. Yes, these are models, but they can give us a general idea about the level of ambition. And I think it's getting easier. So policymakers are understanding the more important role of services, but I think it's also important to present some evidence to back up these services related discussions. So let me try to discuss a little bit some of the new areas that we are presenting in the report, the digital services. We see that there is huge level of heterogeneity when it comes to the regulation of digital services. I have here some slides just to give you an idea. So we looked at the number of issues such as electronic transactions, consumer protection, privacy and data protection, cybercrime, the regulation of artificial intelligence and blockchains. So we did that in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And as you can see, there is a huge variation in both South Asia and Southeast Asia when it comes to the treatment of all these founding blocks, of all these issues which are extremely relevant to trade in digital services. And what we find is that, unsurprisingly, the countries with the most vibrant digital services economies are those with the most complete legislative and regulatory frameworks. So we see in this table that there are important gaps in several countries in the basic legislative infrastructure needed to support digital services, such as looking at privacy and consumer protection. So in many countries, there is no regulation whatsoever in this area. And in this regard, we believe that regional information exchanges between South Asia and Southeast Asia can help address some of these regulatory gaps. And this is especially important for South Asian countries to try to keep up with this rapidly evolving regulatory framework in digital services. So if I want to go back in terms of the national and the regional reforms, so I think the first step would be really developing the supporting policies for digital services in all the areas which we discussed on those two slides. And in terms of the regulatory cooperation that could happen at the regional level, it's an important area for discussion is about the mutual recognition of qualifications and regulations affecting digital services. It is something that is often raised by many firms which try to upgrade, which try to go from the national to the regional level. And interestingly, also by many, it was raised by many small and medium-sized enterprises because they operate, they seem to be prevalent in the digital space. And moving on to environmental goods and services, so trying to make trade between the two regions more sustainable, we looked at the tariffs and non-tariff barriers affecting different environmental goods and services. So what are these environmental goods and services, just to clarify? So we looked at air pollution control or renewable energy, water and waste management, environmental monitoring, assessment analysis, so environmental consulting. And we see, it's very interesting, we see that the tariffs on environmental goods and environmentally preferable goods are much higher in South Asia, but when we move to the non-tariff barriers, it seems that the number of those is applied to environmental goods is much higher in Southeast Asia. So we do not know whether it's mainly driven by data availability issues, but it's quite interesting to see this imbalance between tariffs and non-tariff barriers affecting environmental goods. So between the two regions. So when it comes to policy action, we have here affecting environmental goods and services. Obviously, the starting point would be to reduce the tariffs to boost domestic uptake of cleaner technologies and spur green growth. Adopt the adequate regulations for environmental markets. And what we have here, it's usually trying to come up with an adequate standard that will enable exports from companies located in these two regions, but trying to avoid making it too costly for companies to comply with those standards. It also seems that trade agreements do not include, or they have very limited commitments related to environmental goods and services. So that's another area that policymakers can focus on. And of course, the area of environmental services is extremely new. So we are still grappling with including services on the policy agenda, but I think we need to also try to add environmental services to the group of services sectors that we are considering. So in a nutshell, these are some of the key findings which I wanted to highlight in this presentation. Obviously, the report has more details, more analysis. Also, there is more discussion of the technical issues, that go into all these assessments. But I thought this would be some interesting findings that we could perhaps discuss a little bit in today's session. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, it happens always. You start speaking without unmuting. Thank you, Nora, for this fantastic, comprehensive presentation. Although you kept it at the high level, but still providing so many details that I think at least I have a few to go back to after we hear from Hildegard and Mustafiz. So maybe Nora, you can now stop sharing the screen, and then we can have both Hildegard and Mustafiz on the screen. Okay.
Yes, I'm trying to stop sharing.
Okay, let me do it. Okay, good. I have done it. No problem. I have to do something as a moderator. So let us now hear from Hildegard Nordas, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Nora and her team for an excellent report. I really enjoyed reading it, as it is rich in examples and cases while building on novel and rigorous analysis. I also think that the emphasis on the digital and the green transition is the right one, and the report focuses on the right questions, including regulatory heterogeneity as a barrier, particularly for SMEs. So my comments will focus on the services trade part of the report, since this is where I have my interest and my expertise. So I would like to make two broad points and a few minor points. So the first point relates to the discussion on digital and digitally enabled services. The report has numerous interesting examples of the new opportunities that the digital transition of the economy offers for firms, both large and small. The report also touches upon artificial intelligence, which I find is really amazing, and the additional gains this technology can bring to the region. Bearing in mind the opportunities, it is a bit worrying that among the key services sector discussed, telecommunications face the highest trade barriers. Since telecommunications provide the infrastructure and backbone for the digital economy, higher barriers in this sector are a serious constraint on firms' ability to scale digital services for regional and global markets. Yet, if we look at the ITU indicators, India, Malaysia, Pakistan, Singapore, and Thailand score pretty well on the ITU regulatory tracker and should thus have the regulatory capacity to handle more open markets for telecommunications. Going forward, it's also worrying that digital sovereignty with the protectionist flavor to it is gaining traction, not only in this region. A number of countries has recently introduced data localization requirements, restrictions on cross-border data flows, and digital services taxes. This will not help regional integration, and it will also not help this region better integrate into the global economy at large. I would also like to highlight some findings from the artificial intelligence report from Stanford University to complement your findings. So that reports on some key indicators how countries are doing in artificial intelligence, and it has a global coverage. So in this report, Singapore has the highest rate of AI-related jobs among all the countries covered. And India tops the list when it comes to gender equality in AI skills penetration. So Indian women score higher than men on this indicator, which points to a huge potential for female workers to leverage their skill in AI-enabled services. The Asia Pacific has also taken a lead in developing digital economy agreements, which could enhance regional integration during the digital transformation. And Singapore has been particularly active in engaging in such agreements. My second broad point is about India. Bringing Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia closer together cannot go very far unless India is fully on board. The latest issue of The Economist argues that the 2020s could be India's decade. I have a lot of sympathy for that view. India has everything going for it. It has a very large and fast-growing domestic market, a young, reasonably well-educated and growing labor force, competitiveness in the most future-proof sectors such as IT, media, pharmaceuticals, and renewable energy, and the country is moving into higher skilled services such as engineering. India also has a social safety net administered using cutting-edge technology. Furthermore, women are benefiting from and contributing to technological development for the digital and green transition. However, it's fair to say that India has not enthusiastically embraced regional integration. India did not sign up to the RCEP. It has relatively few FTAs, and I'm not being unfair if I say that it has been known as a naysayer also at the WTO. So although trade negotiations with the EU have resumed after a long period of hibernation. So bringing India on board would really be the great challenge for integration between South Asia and Southeast Asia. So now just a few minor points. So first, the technical point is that the CG model gives unusually large gains, I would say, from a regional integration. So it would be useful to have a brief paragraph comparing to other relevant CG modeling exercises and elaborate a bit on differences and similarities. It would also be useful to explain what preferential liberalization in services might look like, and what is meant by closing half the FDI gap. Is the gap not endogenous, or is it a variable that can be manipulated? Second, a minor point in box 6 on the OECD SGRI might be useful to update, because now it is an annual index that covers the period 2014 to 2021 for 50 countries, 22 sectors, plus a digital SGRI, which is an economy-wide index that applies to regulation with an effect on digital transactions. Third, a comment on the discussion of the importance of services in international trade. We often see this in publications that discusses services trade. And it's true and fair that foreign affiliate sales dwarf cross-border trade in services and are not included in the balance of payments. But this also applies to trading goods. So I guess it needs to be clear that we compare equal with equals here when we compare the importance of trading goods and services. Yeah, and my last point is that the report finds that the share of regional trade in South Asia is smaller than in other regions, and also the share of trade between South Asia and Southeast Asia, particularly exports from South Asia to Southeast Asia. The report may be interpreted as arguing that the share should increase. If so, that would be quite a bit of trade diversion going on. So perhaps a better argument would be to strengthen regional trade, but not necessarily at the expense of extra-regional trade. So those are my comments. And again, I really enjoyed the report, and I find it very useful and novel.
Thank you very much, Hildegard. I think all of your points are well noted, and I hope Nora can come back to some of these, what you call minor but technical issues, to just explain a little bit more on them. Before, and maybe you can put in the chat the reference for this Stanford report, because it would be interesting, I think, for all of us. Let me give floor to Mustafiz now for his comments. Mustafiz.
Yeah, thank you, Mia. This is a great opportunity to pass on my comments on an excellent report. I really enjoyed, as Hildegard also said, the report and the research papers that went into the report. And Nora and her colleagues at the World Bank deserve our deep appreciation. I think that Hildegard, I think, not surprisingly mentioned about services and focused on services, because this is an area which is less researched, but so important. And if we look at the structure of our economies in countries like Bangladesh, 56-57% of our economy is services, and that's the case for almost all the countries in South Asia. So services trade is very very important. So I think the arguments are very compelling, and the results are really telling. And the rigor with which the concerned issues were dealt with are really, I think, have added novelty to what we know and the state of things and what are the potentials. Let me bring a South Asian perspective to the report, if I may, and particularly, Bangladesh is graduating LDCs, and if you look at the South Asia, and 3 of the 7 countries which are mentioned here, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan, we will be graduating out of the LDCs in next few years. Bhutan in 2023 and Nepal and Bangladesh in 2026. So we will have to make a crucial transition from preference-driven competitiveness to productivity, skills, market diversification-driven competitiveness. So for us, market diversification, product diversification, all these will crucially also depend on how deeply we are integrated with our neighbors in the East. So from that perspective, I think it's very important that we prepare ourselves when there will be no preferences once we graduate. So how do we go for export diversification, market diversification? And there, I think the report has a lot to offer us. One point that I think is that when we talk about services, we also have to remember that many of the trade in goods, services are embedded in those trade in goods. So if you are not having competitive services, you cannot be also good in in trade. You lose your competitiveness. So what Nora has mentioned, digital services, e-commerce, all these are also embedded in trade in goods, financial services, logistics services. So if we are not competitive in the services also, and we cannot provide these services at a competitive price, then obviously our competitiveness in trade is also undermined. So I think that this has to be taken also, I think, together. One point that I was thinking is that when we talk about South Asia and Southeast Asia and the countries which were chosen, so South Asia, Afghanistan is not there in the 7-country list. So I understand there may be lack of data. In Southeast Asia, the report includes 10 countries. So if we take ASEAN, it excludes Myanmar. And if we take RCEP, it includes China, but excludes the other countries. So what I would like to mention is that, for example, Bangladesh is now thinking about, as part of its LDC graduation strategy, to get into FTA and comprehensive partnership agreement with, say, ASEAN, or at one go with RCEP. So the point of reference that how Southeast Asia has been defined in the report is something that I think we should think about. I know that this is a world of variable geometry. You have bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral, multilateral, regional. So that can be one point of reference, the way that Southeast Asia has been defined. But I think that it needs a bit of a discussion. Now, with regard to trade liberalization, and I agree that non-discriminatory policy reforms are important, and they will bring us the best results in terms of trade gains. At the same time, I was also thinking, for example, sometimes our trade regimes are also defined by what we face in our markets. Now, Bangladesh, 82% of our export is ready-made garments. So what are the tariffs on ready-made garments in EU? 12%. In USA, 15%. In Canada, 18%. So when we think of liberalizing our trade regime, one will also have to think about what our exports are facing in those countries. Okay, when we are talking about agriculture trade, liberalizing agriculture trade, SPS, TBT, I agree with those. But what about the billions of dollars of subsidies that European Union and the US is giving to the farm sector? And I am asked to liberalize to get into those markets. So I think that when we talk about South Asia and Southeast Asia, we also have to talk about also other countries and also liberalization on the part of others, because there is always a reaction to what on what we do from what we face. Let's formulate it in that way. So this is something I agree fully that tariff, non-tariff barriers, non-tariff measures, and trade facilitation. I think these are, in fact, very closely correlated. And I have seen that yes, non-tariff barriers are there, but many of the obstacles are related to trade facilitation, which becomes non-tariff measures. Now, if we talk about South Asia and Southeast Asia, I think that one will also have to also recall that a lot of initiatives are now being taken in terms of deepening transport connectivity. Multimodal connectivity is parallelly going on. South Asia, the Asian Highway, the Asian Rail Links, the Belt and Road Initiative, India-Bangladesh connectivity, the trilateral transport corridor between India, Thailand, and Myanmar. And Bangladesh is also wanting to join it. So I think that what we have to, I agree that trade and FDI are very closely, and that really gives the, as the results showed, the best outcomes. But the triangulation of transport, trade, and FDI, and complemented by trade facilitation, will give the best results. And there are a lot of initiatives going on in the multilateral in our region, which concerns South Asia also and Southeast Asia also, in terms of multimodal connectivity. So this is so important. The World Bank's earlier report by some of the World Bank colleagues, the glass half full, showed that exporting from Dhaka to Nepal is 1.5 times more costly than exporting from Dhaka to Sao Paulo. Now, this is what is happening. But once we get into transport connectivity, the whole thing changes. And for example, now we are building a lot of connectivity with India, multimodal connectivity, road and also river and connectivity and rail connectivity. And we find that it took 47 years for Bangladesh to export to India to cross $1 billion. It took 4 years to cross $2 billion. Okay, so I think that triangulation is very important. With regard to trade facilitation, I think it is very important, as the report has very rightly mentioned, the regulatory concordance between the countries. And at the border, you will have to have single window. We will have to have interoperability of the system, and there digital connectivity comes, as the report very rightly mentioned. So I think at the border, beyond the border, behind the border, reforms, and the report very rightly mentioned, and I like it, the mutual recognition agreement, accreditations. Those will really help to make the borders not choking points, control points, but really crossing points. And that gives the entrepreneurs, a lot of, gains in terms of, as I was really fascinated, the tariff equivalent of all those, staggering numbers. Average tariff 10% and tariff equivalent of non-tariff barriers more than 220%. So these are really very compelling arguments for going for deeper connectivity. With regard to the environmental, goods, I think it is very good that it has been brought into the discussion, because we are seeing that, for example, if we graduate, we will ask for GSP Plus in the European Union, and the GSP Plus regulations which are being discussed for the next decade, the drafts are already out. They ask for environmental compliance from the companies which will be exporting to the European Union. So all these are also becoming very important as part of competitiveness, rather than just price or lead time. So I think this is very, very, very important. So I would like to, Mia, conclude by once again congratulating the authors, Nora and her colleagues, and this opportunity. And I think that we will, as we go forward and strategize in the context of our LDC graduation, And not only us, Lao PDR in the Southeast Asia is also graduating in 2026. So all these results will be very important for us to strategize in that context. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mustafiz, for this, again, a set of comprehensive comments and remarks, in addition to also a report has stipulated. And I think congratulations definitely in order to Nora and her team for this work that is being done, that reflects on the status, but also points to the possibilities and opportunities that are not utilized so far. If I may, Nora, add just a few more comments, and then I'll give you the opportunity to respond. And I don't think we have actual questions apart from the congratulatory comments in the chat, so we can take time to explore further days. I take to heart what Hildegard was talking about, services in general, but also more concretely about digitally enabled services and the importance of frontier technologies, and in particular, the perhaps a good positioning of India in that context, or maybe even further than India, South Asia in that context, to be able to absorb the technology as the driver of opportunities in that sector. So your modeling has actually focused on using proxy, FDI proxy for mode 3, but all of these that we are talking in a context of these other services and that came through the pandemic is really related to mode 1, and using platforms, exchange of professional services, and again has direct sort of linkage to other area of work that you were undertaking in the report, which is about mobility of people. Because if we try to combine platforms and professional services, then we can actually exploit those instead of moving people directly in terms of low skill migration. And so the comparing the gains from these two approaches of combination of mobility and technology and digitally enabled services. And another thing, Mustafiz, what you were talking very pointedly about the value of trade facilitation, and I will not be doing my job properly if I don't mention that based on UN Global Survey of Implementation of Trade Facilitation Measures, actually, when we compare the average implementation of WTO plus measures across the regions, then actually South Asian countries do less than the average of the total Asia Pacific, while sitting at less than I have numbers somewhere. I will come back to that. But of course, Southeast Asia is much better in that context. So there are definitely lessons to be learned from each other, and the practices to be copied and replicated and improved on. But all of this then, including the facilitation of transport and transit and etc., all of that is really still in a realm of mortar and brick economy, and it's really still looking into manufacturing, right? And so how do we, when we talk about sustainability and sustainable supply chains, etc., all of the work that we need still to do is really in the context of regulatory problems and issues and improving of those policies there, because the question really is for all of these, particularly graduating LDCs, is how to use the secondary latching into the value chains to export through the existing ones, right? And how to do that making themselves actually already at the level of fitting into the regulatory requirements in the export markets that will look at traceability, the mandatory sort of standards requirement and all of that. So I would want to see whether Nora or any of you two would want to comment further on that. And of course, there are many more questions that we can take up. So Nora, back to you.
Thank you, Mia, and thank you very much, Hildegund and Mustafizur, for the very useful feedback. I will try to react to some of the issues that were raised. And perhaps I will start with the selection of the countries which were included in this report. Because the whole idea was to put on the table some fresh options for regional integration for both countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Of course, they have different motivations based on the region, but also based on the status of those countries. As Mustafizur mentioned, many countries are graduating from LDC status, and there is a question on how to boost competitiveness, to make it less based on preferences, but more on productivity. And so here the question is, how can the regional dimension help? So as I said, we try to put on the table some fresh options, and it is not necessarily about some countries joining existing trade agreements. Of course, in theory, that is a possibility, but probably political economy factors will prevent that. So we are discussing in the report that there are options, let's say, looking at, instead of hub and spoke FTAs, at spoke FTAs, yes, to reduce marginalization of certain countries. Another innovative way of thinking about regional integration could be to focus on selected areas of interest, for instance, digital services, or those related to green trade, and look at regulatory cooperation, because this regulatory heterogeneity is something raised by many companies as an important obstacle. So this can be done not necessarily in the context of an agreement, so countries can learn from each other. And if there is interest, if it is clear how productivity will increase, how participation in value chains can be facilitated by removing such obstacles. So countries can be really creative in this regard. And this applies to services, it applies to various trade facilitation rules or some non-tariff measures. So it can be a smaller area where countries can work with each other. And sometimes in the regional context, it can be easier. Regulatory preferences could be more similar, or countries who recently went through certain experiences can share that experience with countries which are less advanced. So that was the whole idea, to put some fresh options on the table. And so that's how we choose the different countries. And it was also important to include China into the whole group, because it is such an important player in the region. And again, Hildegund mentioned that, yes, it will be important to strengthen trade. So it's not about trade diversion. So trying to strengthen it without neglecting the trade with countries which are not included in this group. So that's very important to mention. I believe there was a lot of emphasis on services. And I acknowledge that there has been progress recently in terms of putting services on the policy agenda, but much more work needs to be done in this regard. There is some progress on transport services. We heard indeed in South Asia, so we see many projects are happening. we are also moving into the regulatory area, so it's not only infrastructure related. So again, there is a lot of progress, but many services are still neglected, and we need to do more. I also believe that services and technology could be a new entry point, as you put it, technology and services as a driver for new opportunities. And positions like previous positions could be changed. So I'm thinking here about India's role. India is an extremely important country. And given that is doing so well in digital and digitally enabled services, I'm very keen to read that report, and the gender parity is very interesting. So perhaps India can become a driver for more cooperation in this area, both in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And yes, I believe that this can be India's time to do that. Yes, I agree. With the recent article in The Economist that Hildegard mentioned. So there are new opportunities here, and we will also try to present these results to induce policymakers to think a little bit more creatively about what can be done, especially as we discussed in the current context that it's so unstable and uncertain. There were some technical questions, and so I will try to address those. When we are modeling services, yes, we are using FDI as a proxy for mode 3, but we are not neglecting mode 1. So we are also incorporating the tariff equivalence for mode 1. So we have mode 1 and mode 3 in the model. It is true that liberalization of digital services is not captured at this stage. So the tariff equivalents that we have are for the more traditional sectors, and we all know these are imperfect. But in terms of model coverage, I just wanted to highlight that we are more comprehensive than just mode 3. And we will try to compare the results with the previous literature. Some of the high gains are driven by the extremely high tariff equivalence for both non-tariff barriers and services included in the model. So we will provide some explanation. We can still include it in the report. So that's very useful. And on the foreign affiliates, again, yes, I agree that we need to compare equal to equal, as Hildegard put it. So thank you for the technical points, and I believe this is what I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. There was we are actually out of time by now, but there was a comment from the participant side saying that perhaps we should comment on the current situation with vulnerability of many poor people in South Asia, in particular with respect to food prices. I think we are all pretty much aware of that, and of course not only that, but of the particularly their situation of Sri Lanka and the problems there. So if any of the speakers would want to add to that, I can we can spare a minute or so on that, as well as also on the current sort of situation, and to recognize the situation that the global economy is sort of facing the risk of fragmentation, and how that risk may provide a positive force for these two regions to look at closer cooperation in a context of defending the sustainable development for themselves as well. So if you want to make comments on that, anyone, please just start speaking.
Yeah, can I?
Yes, please, Mustafiz.
Yeah. No, I think the question that has been raised is very important in the current context. We are seeing imported inflation all around. Purchasing power of the marginalized people are being eroded day by day. So it has really become a major issue as we speak today. For example, we are talking about deeper cooperation, but there are countries, even in South Asia, India has banned export of wheat. And in reaction, prices in Bangladesh has gone up. But India has said that it will look after its neighbors. On the other hand, we have also seen Malaysia and Indonesia, putting restrictions on export of palm oil. So we, on the one hand, we are talking about deeper integration. On the other hand, we are also putting barriers whenever there is any inkling of any problem with regard to food security. So it just speaks about the challenges, I think. I just wanted to make two very brief, just with regard to appreciation that the study has, I think, for the first time, has brought into the picture the migration. I think it's mode 4. Which I haven't seen, that is so sensitive that people don't discuss this or don't bring it in this type of discussion. So this is very important, because if we want to have mode 3, mode 1, we cannot avoid mode 4. So this is very important. The last point, very briefly, Mia, is that we also should follow the discussions on e-commerce, for example, on investment in the WTO. So I think that there are disciplines being put there. If we can have multilateral agreements, which we will follow, obviously, I think that also helps to have a more regulated and level playing field in terms of digital commerce and also investment regime that Nora was mentioning. Thank you.
Definitely, Mustafiz. I would like to say just a couple of words on what you were mentioning in terms of WTO. Both e-commerce and investment facilitation is being done through the joint statement initiatives, and I believe that we are at the point, at a juncture, to decide whether they will be open sort of agreements for everyone to join on later on when they feel ready, and how to integrate it in a total WTO structure. And that seems to be, well, we are facing ministerial very soon, so we'll see whether there are any progress on that. And with respect to this national protectionism, or economic nationalism, whatever you want to call it, that springs up any time when we have external shocks. I'm a strong believer in that being driven by the lack of trust between the governments, and that trust can be actually raised by formalization of certain understanding of mutual assistance and help between the countries. And when such frameworks, like in ASEAN with respect to rice, or in Chiang Mai initiative in terms of financial side, right? When we have this understanding, then I think the panicking of national governments in the context of providing where it may be just a false sort of security, but still the action is there to provide national sort of defense in face of external shocks, that would weaken somewhat. So we need to work on really somehow enabling governments to trust each other more in that respect, right? And this is a tough call, but on the other hand, we need to pursue this nevertheless. I think what is also important, and we didn't have time to talk about that, but maybe we can continue at some other time, is really how this deepening between South Asia and Southeast Asia depends on the collaboration between businesses in these two regions and how businesses can drive certain initiatives. Because in the end, the investment, unless it is huge infrastructural investment, but the trade in particular and all these new technological advances are driven by corporations and businesses. And so how do we actually bring them into the story to help the governments on either side to succeed? So any last words from you, Hildegard?
Yes, so I fully agree with Mustafa that the infrastructure is extremely important for integrating, particularly both in goods and services, and that is something that needs to be kind of put to the table, and more attention on that. And to the current situation with kind of disintegration and food prices and other prices going up. One lesson, I think, from the COVID epidemic was that once the crisis hit, the immediate reaction from countries was protectionism, and we need to take care of our own people and export restrictions and all this. But it was pretty quickly learned that we cannot actually make it on our own in this situation. And you saw this kind of dying down, and countries started to cooperate. And I think it's extremely important to do the same now. So if countries start introducing export restrictions to look after their own population, it might backfire also on their own population. So I would really like to see that lessons are drawn from the COVID pandemics. So I think I'll stop there.
That's a fantastic message to actually end up with, because we have all the reasons to actually support core cooperation and collaboration and integration and discussion between countries and different stakeholders. I think, of course, business, but this particular forum is a discussion of academia and analysts and those that actually have ear of policymakers. So it's very important to continue this conversation. So I thank you very, very much for the opportunity given to ARTNeT to actually be one of the first to learn about this particular report. And we look forward to the future events that will be organized about the dissemination of the report, and be still ready to support it and to also engage with the research community in both South Asia and Southeast Asia in spreading the word from the reports, and also building capacity based on that in terms of how to use research and new data to support good policy making. So thank you very, very much. And I wish you all well and stay safe. We still are facing some remnants of the pandemic everywhere. So do please take care. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
And so, Nora, we will also share the slides. If you send me the copy that we can put on the website, that will be great. All right. Thanks a lot.
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
will do that. Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.